Of all the recurring monsters, of all the fabled creatures of the night, out of every lurking horror that waits to prey on innocents stalking people in the shadows, the vampire has always been my favorite. Vampires have been around for at least as long as the Persians, where archaeologists have uncovered pottery shards that seem to show art depicting men having their blood drained by monsters. Hebrew parents used to hang amulets around their children's cradles in fear of a monstrous woman named Lilith, the mother of vampires and queen of demons, who would eat babies and prey upon women. Yes, throughout ancient civilization, whether they were called Lamia, Strigoi, Vitalis, Aluka, Revenants, or anything else, vampiric-like creatures have been something to be feared. I mention all of this because none of those legends really resemble the vampires shown in pop culture, whether they be movies, books, or video games. Indeed, it is hard to look at Nicolas Cage's performance of Count Dracula and see much of what Albanian vampires were described as. But without even going so far back, he doesn't look much of like how early pop culture described even Count Dracula himself. I'm absolutely fascinated by the portrayal of vampires in our pop culture, and I want to explore the journey of what changed for these bloodsuckers' portrayal in our entertainment, and also what stayed the same.
Sorry.
In my humble opinion, the place where our modern idea of vampires starts with Carmilla, a novella by Irish author Sheridan Le Fanu. This story is largely about the relationship between protagonist Laura and her mysterious titular friend Carmilla, whom she remembered in a dream she had one time as a child. Now, there is a lot to say about this book because outside of it being one of the first, if not the first, vampire novels in popular fiction, it is also notable for its portrayal of lesbianism as beautiful and mutual relationship in a time period where that was very much not seen as the norm, and also portraying men and women as equals in a time period where that too was not seen as the norm. These topics and others are worth writing essays on themselves, and I would encourage people to check out what people have written about this book concerning those topics. But I'm mostly going to focus on its portrayal of vampirism here. Carmilla establishes a few things here that would come to be motifs for the vampire genre for more than a century after. The dark setting of an old castle makes an appearance here, as well as a beautiful and seductive, supernaturally powerful figure. The vampire, Carmilla, is seen in dreams. Victims wake after imagining wounds in their neck, and then seeing none there at all. Carmilla can change in the form of an animal, notably a cat in this story. There is a vampire expert, not exactly Van Helsing, but a character of equal importance for the story, nevertheless. And Carmilla is eventually found faintly breathing in her tomb, where she is executed by a stake being plunged through her heart and her head cut off. Already, we're off to a great start of where some iconic vampire legends in our own media come from. Carmilla establishes these ideas in a mysterious prose. To this day, some of the best vampire stories are still told in this aura of mystery. 26 years after Carmilla, Bram Stoker would release his masterpiece, Dracula, easily the most recognizable name in the vampire genre. That goes without even being said. Bram Stoker did not only borrow a great many ideas from Carmilla, including the description of his character Mina, but Bram Stoker was largely inspired from Romanian history and mythology as well. His vampiric character, the titular Dracula, is almost certainly inspired from Vlad the Impaler, who was known as Vlad Dracula. He was not only a ruler of Romania, but he was also infamous for his cruelty, getting his nickname from making a forest of impaled people. He was also rumored to drink the blood of people as it trickled down from the bodies onto the wooden posts. A lot has been written about Bram Stoker's influences he derived from history, such as what might have inspired Bordegal Pass, the route the stagecoach driver might have taken Jonathan Harker to meet with Count Dracula, as well as the possible inspirations from Elizabeth Bathory, the Hungarian serial killer who bathed in her victim's blood. These are all very interesting and worth discussing on their own, but I particularly want to focus on what Bram Stoker wanted to convey to his audience about vampires. In his story, they were absolutely evil. Dracula feeds 3 vampire women a small bound child near the beginning of the story. It is implied that Dracula himself has devoured babies, much like the legends of older vampires from mythology. In fact, that's why Stoker's Van Helsing character very much works to inform us, as Edward Van Sloan's portrayal of the character says in Todd Browning's adaptation.
Wolfbane. It is a plant that grows in Central Europe. The natives there use it to protect themselves against vampires. Sometimes they take the form of wolves, but generally of bats. Vampire casts no reflection in the glass. That is why Dracula smashed the mirror.
Dracula was haunting because it felt like a legend was being brought to life in a contemporary way for the audience of the time. A vampire strolling through streets illuminated by gas lamps, walking the city streets. That's the essence of the horror of Dracula. Bram Stoker attached rules to vampires on top of Carmilla, like how they only sleep with the soil of their homeland. And the whole thing about garlic warding vampires off, and also involved Dracula's intention of turning Mina into a vampire by a process of having her consume his blood. With Carmilla and Dracula, we are already set for how vampires would be perceived at the turn of the century. Film was becoming a popular storytelling device, and filmmakers quickly began work on adapting books to film. While Dracula was, in fact, adapted to a silent film, the one that is remembered for its cultural influence was, of course, Nosferatu. F.W. Murnau was basically just copying the plot of Dracula, with the otherwise titular character being replaced by a Count Orlok, and all the characters having German names, as it was intended for a German audience after all. The visual representation of Count Orlok is particularly noteworthy. The vampires were treated as less visually monstrous and more like beautiful people who were monsters inside. This itself will become influential going forward, but the other big influential moment from this movie is how Count Orlok dies. Not a stake through the heart, not a beheading, not a corpse burning, but by the sun coming up. This was the first time that the sun was suggested as being able to kill a vampire. Before, daytime was just vampires not awake time, but Nosferatu suggested that this was because the sun was literally lethal to them. This fact especially was incredibly influential to vampire stories going forward. But vampire movies were still not really a thing, and certainly not a genre yet. But all that would kind of change once Todd Browning released one of the masterpieces of his career. The 1931 film adaptation of Dracula is amazing for many, many reasons. The atmosphere, the storytelling, the suspense, and being the absolute embodiment of how mysterious and haunting a vampire story can be. But also because of the characters. Edward Van Sloan portraying Professor Van Helsing in an iconic way, really making his mark on what would become an iconic role. Dwight Frye, portraying Renfield, a role that would lay down the blueprint of what a vampire thrall would be. And finally, there is Bela Lugosi, who to this day has given the most iconic portrayal of Count Dracula ever. Period.
I am Dracula.
Bela Lugosi's Dracula is unforgettable. The man basically embodied that character, and anyone who ever played Dracula on film or on stage in a serious or not serious tone would be influenced by Bela Lugosi as seen in this film.
I bid you welcome.
For audiences in 1931, Bela Lugosi's name was synonymous with Dracula himself. While there were some vampire stories coming out, Dracula would remain the most well-known vampire of all time, spawning a film franchise that seemed never-ending. For nearly 50 years, if you wanted your vampire story to be seen by audiences, you would be putting some variation of Dracula in the title. By the 1980s, a few ideas of vampire stories had been more clearly defined and expanded on. Van Helsing went from being a scientist who understood what vampirism was and how to defeat it, to a fully fledged vampire hunter, oftentimes complete with vampire hunting gear and specialized weapons. Many iterations would be seen of a vampire thrall, not all as eloquent and morally conflicted as Renfield was, some being nothing more than obedient slaves.
You no longer have anything to say about what you do.
But for a while, vampires were rarely depicted as anything more than bloodthirsty monsters who would blend in amongst mortal humans, with their hypnosis being able to pass as little more than charm, good looks, and charisma. But there were a few concepts that reached back into the more romantically gothic roots of Carmilla as well. And there was Dracula's daughter, which saw a vampire wanting to cure her vampiric affliction to become human. We'll come back to this one a little bit later. One such idea was explored in the 1966 soap opera Dark Shadows that introduced the vampire Barnabas Collins. Collins had the unique opportunity to be written as both a monster and something resembling a human with memories and emotions.
There you are.
But that door was shut tight. How did you open it?
It requires a technique and a little practice.
You sound as though you've spent a lot of time here.
Do I?
At first, Collins was enraptured with a waitress named Maggie Evans, who resembled his long-lost love, Josette. Collins hypnotized Maggie Evans to make her think that she was, in fact, Josette, and planned to marry her, turning her into his vampire bride. But after that attempt failed and Maggie was sent to the sanitarium, it was made clear what Barnabas Collins was, and the hunt for him was on. And while that introduction to Barnabas Collins presented him as yet another vampire monster, albeit with some longing and nostalgia usually not associated with the creatures as of the time, Collins' character afterwards involved him becoming less monstrous and more mysterious and sympathetic. Throughout episodes of the show, Barnabas was attracted to several different women. There was also unrequited love between him and his assistant, Dr. Julia Hoffman, for her part. She was in love with him, but it would never be returned. While the Barnabas Collins arc of Dark Shadows was short-lived, it was incredibly influential and culturally impactful. It was especially popular amongst teenagers, as it had a time slot that put it as something that would come on shortly after many kids arrived home from school. After Dark Shadows, however, came one of the most influential novels of all time, Interview with the Vampire. It was dropped in 1973 by Anne Rice. Anne Rice was inspired greatly by Gloria Holden's character in Dracula's Daughter, and said this of this inspiration: "It established to me what vampires were, these elegant, tragic, sensitive people. I was really just going with that feeling when writing Interview with the Vampire. I didn't do a lot of research." Interview with the Vampire describes a sort of duality between vampires. On one hand, we have Louis, who finds it morally repugnant to feed on humans and instead feeds on animals. And then we have Lestat, who not only hunts and feeds on and kills humans, but also has quite a few human slaves, whom are all killed by Lestat when they try to instigate an uprising against him. There is a lot to unpack here in this story. Lestat is a very interesting character himself, but he's very much a more traditional, almost Dracula-like figure compared to every other vampire in this story. Louis is happy to be a vampire, but wants to be a good vampire if that is possible. However, Claudia, a young girl, turned against her will, hates what she is, resenting the reality of her eternal youth, but growing wisdom, and hates Lestat for what he has done to her. Then there is Louis and Armand, who are very attracted to each other. Armand has something that before this had really only been mentioned and suggested in vampire stories, but not really explored. A coven of vampires existing together. Armand and his coven do shows in a theater where they kill and eat humans in front of paying audience members who are convinced it is just a very realistic show. And this idea of a hidden collective of vampires with rules and laws concerning each other, a secret underground organization of them, is one of the legacies of Interview with the Vampire. That, and of course, as mentioned before, the relationship between Louis and Armand, who truly care for each other. But that relationship sadly doesn't last. Louis is a vampire scarred by the horrific things he's witnessed, the things he's done, and the ages past that he has seen. He finds many aspects of immortality a burden, and that too would become a large theme of vampire storytelling going forward. Other than that, Interview with the Vampire continues a lot of established storytelling from previous vampire entries. The sun is still as lethal as it was in Nosferatu, vampires are just as evil as they were in Dracula, and vampires are as romantic as they were in Carmilla. And unlike Carmilla, which understandably had to be more discreet about its homosexual romance, Interview with the Vampire is much more open about it. Several homosexual relationships occur in the story, continuing the queer representation that vampire stories have had since the beginning. Romance, in general, has been a theme of vampiric storytelling, and its inclusivity had only gotten stronger after this masterpiece of a novel. By the late 1980s, the Goth movement and Goth subculture began in the UK, and with it, vampires became a part of the aesthetic. Part of Goth fashion was inspired by Victorian and Edwardian era dresses and clothing, which so happened to be where and when a lot of Gothic fiction, particularly vampire stories, happened to take place. And as the Goth movement included music, songs about vampires, the metaphor of what they do, the myth of what they are, and the sex appeal of their very appearance were in the foreground of quite a bit of it. Many consider Bauhaus's song Bela Lugosi's Dead to be the first goth rock single, after all. It was also featured in the 1983 horror film The Hunger. As goth culture became more influenced by punk, vampires began to adopt some punk looks themselves. Goth rock was an aesthetic, and one that fictional vampires would come to share. Indeed, vampires going forward through the 80s would principally be rooted in this goth subculture, and one of the first films to incorporate this look was The Lost Boys. In this horror comedy, the vampires are young punks who live the nightlife out on the boardwalk, and they are monsters. There are also half-vampires who didn't ask to be turned into these monsters. They share some similarities with full vampires, but notably the sun doesn't kill them. This idea of half-vampires and how the sun affects vampires would start to come and go. The looks and aesthetics of the goth movement would follow through the 90s with films like Blade, which we'll come back to, but also in the less contemporary vampire looks, and one that reached towards more classics, like Francis Ford Coppola's portrayal of Bram Stoker's Dracula. The 90s film adaptation of Interview with the Vampire sits in this sort of middle ground between the two, gothic but classic in an earlier time period, but with contemporary thoughts and ideas of what being a vampire is about. In and around the same time, another medium of storytelling had just been created in video games. What would come to be one of the most classic video games, Castlevania, depicted a pixel version of Dracula as well as other vampires the character would have to fight or avoid. It features pretty well-known depictions of vampires by now, regal yet obviously monstrous, as well as various creatures of the night who are monstrous all on their own. Before we look deeper at video game vampires, it's important to note that tabletop role-playing games were also becoming increasingly popular. While Dungeons & Dragons had its vampire antagonists from the Monster Manual, and Stroud, their very own Dracula-like figure, a company called White Wolf had published in 1991 and 1992 what would end up being the definitive vampire experience for a lot of people today, Vampire the Masquerade. Vampire the Masquerade made a similar assertion that Interview with the Vampire and Lost Boys had done before. Vampires are real, living amongst us, in the shadows, immortal and powerful, finding ways to prey upon humans. This universe also establishes a vampire secret society called the Camarilla that protects them from the prying eyes of the vampire hunters. In this, players can play in different clans to utilize special vampiric powers. Some of these may sound familiar. One could play as a Toreador, a beautiful or handsome individual capable of seduction and persuading mortals to do their bidding by their enthralling commands. One could play as a Bruja, a gothic punk creature who would sooner use their vampiric strength to throw someone out a window than to listen to them talk. Or even as a Nosferatu, a warped, terrifying creature who skulks in the shadows, as their very appearance is enough to make humans believe in monsters. Vampire the Masquerade is incredibly deep and complex, and these simplifications do not do it justice. The lore it has developed over 30 years is incredibly rich and intricate. It takes care to establish vampiric society through all of human history, through moments like the Dark Ages and World War II. While some stories had written about the implied existence of vampiric society before, no one had done it like this. While Vampire the Masquerade, Interview with the Vampire, and others had taken a more sympathetic look at the creatures, another perspective was being explored as well. Back in the 1950s, Dracula was being fought by the vampire hunter Van Helsing, and while Christopher Lee was usually the Dracula, and Peter Cushing was usually the Van Helsing, Dracula was always the antagonist here, portrayed in his usual 1800s or 1900s setting, and Van Helsing was always the brave vampire hunter to take him down. The idea about hunting vampires down and killing them to save all of mortal kind found its real inception during this filming time period, but by the time the 90s were through with it, it had become a beloved pastime for audiences. Castlevania, the video game series, of course, put you as the vampire hunter Belmont, chasing down Dracula to kill him. Many video games such as Nocturne, Vampire Hunter D, Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver, put you as a character against many creatures of the night. Among them, notably, were vampires.
I'm sorry. 'Tis my fault you had to fight your own father.
Fear not. I had my own reasons for destroying him.
A popular film, Blade, half vampire, who was therefore the perfect vampire hunter, had all the powers of a vampire but could also go out in the sunlight, which, as you can see, has remained an important defining feature of vampire storytelling. The previously mentioned video game, Legacy of Kain, also had a half-vampire protagonist hunting them down as well. And one simply cannot mention the 90s without talking about Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Buffy is just a high school girl who just so happens to have been gifted by supernatural forces the strength and ability to fight vampires and other evil supernatural forces. Vampires in the show are secretive and hidden amongst humans, but when they turn to feed on them, they are revealed to be something else entirely. Along with normalizing vampire media as something not just strictly for horror fans and goths anymore, this visualization influenced a lot of vampire media going forward, but it was also another in a very influential line of vampire hunting media that continues to this day. White Wolf published a game in their World of Darkness universe where Vampire the Masquerade takes place, where you play as the perspective of the hunters as well, called Hunter the Reckoning. This trend continued into the 2000s as well. The video game series Blood Rain had players take control of a half-human, half-vampire who hunted vampires like Blade did. Dracula 2000 was mostly about Van Helsing passing on his mantle to the next great vampire hunter who perhaps could finally kill Dracula for good. Through all of this, vampire hunters followed the same principles as Carmilla and Dracula had laid out in stories before. Stake through the heart, cut off their head, expose them to sunlight, use holy water, use crucifixes, the whole thing. In fact, by now, these things have become so ingrained in vampire media that if any of those conventions were to change, it had to be established clearly for the audience to understand.
Well, you can still be destroyed, but forget the boobs and the booze. Garlic, works. A cross, shove it right up their ass.
What about crucifixes?
Crucifixes.
Yeah, can you look at them?
Actually, I'm quite fond of looking at crucifixes.
How about the old stake through the heart thing?
Nonsense.
By the mid-2000s, vampire storytelling had come to a bit of a crossroads. The genre itself was split into different subgenres, attracting their own audiences. There were vampire hunter stories, which depicted vampires as evil and the hunters as good for the most part. There were vampire society stories, which depicted the bloodsuckers as being things that were morally gray and ultimately misunderstood. And lastly, there was paranormal romance. Vampire hunter stories included things like the films Van Helsing and 30 Days of Night, shows like Helsing and Daybreakers, and video games like Hunter the Reckoning and Darkwatch. Vampire society stories included movies like Queen of the Damned and Underworld, games like Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, and is talked about while built upon in fantasy series like The Elder Scrolls and The Dresden Files.
This is sacred ground, neutral territory.
Paranormal romance, particularly ones about vampires, featured shows like Vampire Diaries and Rosario plus Vampire, but would largely be explored in novels like Vampire Academy, the Black Dagger Brotherhood series, and Mercy Thompson series, and of course, Twilight. There is a lot to criticize about Twilight and its subsequent movie spin-offs, but it's also worth noting how influential it was. Paranormal romance as a genre boomed in the 2000s and still remains strong to this day, particularly when it involves vampires. For those familiar with a lot of the stories mentioned here, there is something else I haven't touched on. A lot of these also involve werewolves, as well as other creatures of the night and legends that were adapted stories before. In the 1940s, Universal did a lot of crossover movies that featured expanded universes wherein all of these nightmarish creatures existed. That influence remains today, suggesting that vampires not only walk among us in the shadows at night, but that they are not the only mysterious dark creatures out there looking to prey upon mortals. Particularly, werewolves and vampires are often depicted together because they share something unique in the fact that they were once human beings who were transformed into these monsters, willingly or not. In some ways, they both seem free, and yet they are bound to a set of rules they must obey, or suffer the extreme consequences. Just as vampires may be depicted to have a fear of garlic or holy water, so too do werewolves avoid silver or wolfbane. Depictions of vampires have often appeared with werewolves alongside them, and that includes every little subgenre of vampire media. Today, vampires are still just as popular as ever. They've changed over the decades and gained different followings, but throughout all of that, some things haven't changed at all. From stakes through the heart, an aversion to sunlight, a thirst for blood, a seductive nature, and all the threat of being hunted. Vampires occasionally wear black clothes, turn into animals, fly, fall in love, or plot to rule the world in the 1800s or modern days. They have fascinated us for more than a century, all the way from the original lesbian love story to an entire society who hunts humans and hides from hunters. Vampire stories are here to stay, and it will be fascinating to watch how their narrative continues to evolve, perhaps for another century still.
He's a guy who's with when I was human.
No, gone?
When I was human. Yeah, he's gone. I've been drowning him all night. I've been a very thirsty girl.